Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our Skill Up series. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer in the Graduate Studies Support Center, formerly known as the CTL. I am joined this evening with two of our professors from the Stanford College of Education for our Part 2 session of Qualitative Research Designs with Dr. Linda Blomberg and Dr. Janet Boberg. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started on our presentation this evening. Please do pop your questions in the chat. We will go ahead and get to addressing questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Dr. Blomberg, I think that covers all of my housekeeping items for you. And for this presentation, before I pass it right on over to you for our Part 2 session.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you to you and also to the Graduate Study Support Center for having us here present for the Skill Up series. This is Part 2 of Qualitative Research Designs. Part 1 was last week, and the recording is available through you and also posted in the Commons. The learning objectives for this two-part series are to make qualitative research designs understandable and easy to apply by way of discussing the key design features for each of the research designs, looking at the methods of data collection, methods of data analysis, and also presentation of findings for each of the designs that we're going to be looking at here today, which are ethnography, narrative inquiry, and grounded theory. And we're also going to be providing practical application by way of dissertation examples. As you'll see with each of the research designs, we will give you the links to some excellent dissertations that have used these particular research designs. In the presentation, we're also going to identify specific terminology that is associated with each of the designs. And we'll also clarify the implications and the importance of choosing a specific research design based on a researcher's problem, purpose, and research questions. And we're going to be talking a lot about this as we move through all of the designs. To start off, I'm going to just give a brief overview of qualitative research designs, as I did in last week's presentation, for those of you who may not have heard it, because it is really worth reiterating the important features of the designs themselves. Firstly, research design is a core component of any research study, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And so selecting an appropriate design is critical to a study's rigor and quality. As you'll see, as we move through these three designs, and as we did last week with case study and phenomenology, there are significant variations in how a qualitative study can be designed and conducted. The research designs themselves are typically derived either from research methods, as in case study, from a philosophy, as in phenomenology, or from a theory, as in grounded theory. And each of the qualitative research designs, which are sometimes referred to as traditions or genres in the literature, encompass very, very specific ways of identifying and addressing a researchable problem, of ways in which a study can be set up, and also the ways in which data is collected, analyzed, and presented. So remember, something that's really important to bear in mind all along is that developing a sound and feasible research design is similar to constructing a strong foundation for a building or a house. And even though certain buildings may follow a similar footprint, ultimately each building is unique. And so each study is unique, and the research design that you choose is really the basis for a solid study. And that is why we're going to be discussing this in a little bit more detail toward the end. Choosing a specific design rather than a generic approach is critical to establishing a rigorous and high quality qualitative study. The goal is to ensure that your research design addresses all of the following aligned components upon which your study is built. And this includes your research problem, your research purpose, and your research questions. Remember, a researcher has to consider whether methods of data collection and data analysis will apply appropriately to their selected design. And this means that you have to be really familiar with each design so that you can choose the correct design and then select your data collection and data analysis methods to line up with that design and to be part of that design's setup. What is really important to remember all along is that a viable and appropriate research design is essential so that your study is methodologically congruent. And this goes back to the idea of being very specific rather than generic. There really is no place for generic research in terms of selecting a qualitative design. So let's talk a little bit now about just that, selecting and justifying your research design. The appropriate research design that you choose must be aligned with your study's specific research problem, research purpose, and research questions. A research problem should never be modified or changed to fit a particular design. Rather, you choose your design based on your problem, purpose, and research question. So it is basically, the idea is to base it on your research design and problem rather than try and fit a specific problem into a design. Selecting an appropriate design relates to what I said a few minutes ago, the overall concepts of methodological congruence and alignment. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about alignment in a few moments. And remember that as a researcher, you will need to justify your decision by carefully and clearly describing the reason for your choice of research design. So let's look at the actual designs themselves. Last week, we looked at case study and phenomenology as the first two major research designs. Today, we're going to be covering ethnography, narrative inquiry, and grounded theory. And for each of these research designs, we're going to be following a similar format to what we followed last week. Dr. Boberg and I are going to be looking at these research designs in terms of an overview. We're then going to be looking more specifically at the data collection methods, methods of data analysis, presentation of findings that are specific to the particular research design. And finally, we're going to be presenting you with links to some excellent dissertation studies that have used the particular design that we're looking at. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Boberg.
So as like last week, if you attended last week, I want everybody to put your research hat on, and specifically your qualitative research hat, as we delve more into ethnography, narrative inquiry, and grounded theory. So let's talk about ethnography. And the way that I'm going to start this is I'm going to read a passage from a book called Never in Anger by Jean L. Briggs, who did an ethnography beginning in 1963. In the summer of 1963, I went to the Canadian Northwest Territories to make a 17-month anthropological field study of the small group of Eskimos who live at the mouth of the Back River northwest of Hudson Bay. These 20 to 35 Eskimos who call themselves Utku are the sole inhabitants of an area that is 35,000 or more miles square. The nearest other people are 150 miles away in a small mission and trading settlement known as Joa Haven of perhaps 100 Eskimos. I chose this unusually isolated group as a subject of study because I was interested in the social relationships of shamans. When I did finally ascertain that no information on shamanism would be forthcoming, I was, of course, compelled to find some other aspect of life to study. The choice of subject was determined in part by factors beyond my control, especially by my limited knowledge of the language and by the Utku's reticence, and during a certain period of my stay, by their resistance to my presence. Because of the language barrier during the first year of my stay at Back River, I was confined very largely to recording those aspects of life that were tangible and visible. In this book, I shall describe Utku emotional patterning in the context of their life as I saw and lived it during my 17 months in Chantry Inlet. Instead of attempting to make a formal structural or psychological analysis for which I lack the requisite systematic data, I shall draw a series of vignettes of individual Utku interacting with members of their family and with their neighbors. I feel that this approach will make maximum use of the research situation. The smallness of the group study, the intimacy of my living arrangements, and the resulting richness of the behavioral data that I obtained. So welcome to ethnography. So the father of ethnography is a man by the name of Bronislaw Malinowski, and it started in social anthropology. In the US, Henry Schoolcraft and Margaret Mead really kind of were the premier researchers, and Margaret Mead did a lot of field work in Samoa. So ethnography is really rooted in cultural anthropology, and it requires that extended observation of groups. In the passage that I just read by Briggs, she was there embedded with the Utku for 17 months. And she was a participant observer because she immersed herself in the lives of the research participants. So what ethnographers are interested in is social change, which we call critical ethnography, or studying populations that have been marginalized or overlooked, such as the Utku, and also feminist theory, queer theory, and trans theory, and ethno theory, and many of the other indigenous research type theories. An ethnographic researcher will kind of seek to look at the cultural past of a group of people in order to uncover their cultural roots and whether and how the group has changed over time. And this is known as an ethnohistory. An ethnographer may be interested in their own personal experience by engaging in extensive self-reflection to explore their own cultural and contextual description and analysis, looking at their own life. And we refer to this as an autoethnographer. And it's really interesting because the autoethnographer is really the only instance where the sample size would include a single individual. So that's kind of a little bit about the background of ethnography. So how do we collect data in an ethnography? The researcher studies an entire cultural or social group in its natural setting, like embedding themselves in the culture. And they closely look at the customs and the ways of life that their participants portray. Fieldwork is the cornerstone of this type of data collection, and this involves the researcher's participation in a community or setting for that extended period of time. So with an ethnography, the researcher really has to understand there's going to be a significant time commitment to this type of research. As I shared with Briggs, that was 17 months. And the aim is to holistically describe and interpret cultural patterns of behavior, values, and practices. And Van Manen is now a more recent ethnographer who really discusses in detail the data collection of ethnography. And what they want to do, the ethnographers, is really produce a cultural portrait that the researcher can gain access to the group through what we call gatekeepers and key informants. So many times the ethnographer will actually attempt to make excellent, I guess, rapport or develop excellent rapport with the individuals in the group that they're studying who have maybe, I guess you would call it kind of a sense of what the entire group is about, maybe an elder or the commander or whatever they want to call it of that particular group. So ethnographers study groups, and that can include communities or organizations. And by making use of a variety of data collection methods, and they can use the participant observation because they are a participant observer. They can use interviews, document reviews, artifacts. They can even use photographs. So photography and video and electronic media are also becoming increasingly incorporated into the work of ethnographers. And a researcher by the name of Pink goes into great detail about the imagery that can be used from ethnography. I was very lucky to attend a visual ethnography conference in 2005 in San Francisco and spend a week with significant researchers in the field to learn about visual ethnography from a perspective of photography. And that was an awesome, awesome experience. So if any of you are really interested in it, this is another option for photography, video, and electronic media. Moving on to data analysis, when we look at ethnographic data analysis, the goal is to look at patterns as well as anything that's irregular by examining thoroughly the data for explanations of the studied culture. The approaches include something called cultural analysis. We can also use thematic analysis, which we use frequently with case studies. We can use visual analysis, narrative analysis, content analysis, as well as discourse analysis. And the final product of analysis is really that holistic, it's a cultural portrait of the group that incorporates the participants' views, which we call the emic, as well as the researcher's view, which we call etic. And so this is how we're going to analyze the ethnographic data. So how do we present the findings? So we really learn about the cultural sharing group from the participants themselves, as well as from the perspective of the researcher, as we just shared with the data analysis. But Gertz actually coined the term thick description, which is an emphasis on the need to understand what we observe and how we systematically document that which we observe in our field work. Van Manen recommended presenting ethnographic research through different styles of tales, as well as visual materials, as a way of presenting an authentic cultural portrait. So think about that. We're providing tales of that from that participant observer, as well as from the participants in the group that we're studying, but we're also adding that visual material so it truly comes to life. And the way that we can do this is by realist tales, and that displays a realistic account of the cultural, which is published in the third person voice. We can use confessional tales, which is a highly personalized account that displays the author's power of observation and calls attention to building credible and authentic cultural description. Or we can use something called the impressionist tale, and the researcher then relates their own experiences as an autoethnographic account. So we've got 3 examples of dissertations, one from Vanessa Martinez from UMass Amherst, another from Sarah Jean Baker from the Texas State University, and Tina Atkins from Liberty University. And what I challenge you, and Dr. Bloomberg challenges you to do, if you do go and look at any or all of these 3 ethnographic examples, is really to focus in on the problem, purpose, and research questions, and how they set up their ethnographic dissertation. So we're going to move into the narrative inquiry. And I'm going to share a passage from Dr. Michael Watson from Texas A&M and his narrative research titled "Bad Kids Gone Good, a narrative inquiry study of alternative education graduates." He starts out, "There is evidence to suggest that students who fail to graduate from high school are more prone to seek assistance from government programs such as welfare, commit crime, and experience health problems as compared to students that graduate from high school. This issue has captured the attention of various stakeholders in education in an effort to keep students in school until completion in order to avoid such negative outcomes for the nation and the students that drop out. The students that have are garnered this attention and are labeled at risk." Now, considering that term "at risk," many alternative education programs have grown considerably over the last 20 years, and it appears this trend is likely to continue. Many alternative schools have been created to offer a second chance opportunity for students whose academic needs are not met in the traditional educational setting. Many contemporary alternative schools have developed a negative connotation as they are thought of as being places for students whose behaviors are disruptive, deviant, and dysfunctional. This negative connotation has left many at-risk students to feel marginalized because they're labeled as something deviant from normal for not performing to desired standards or for disrupting the smooth operation of traditional settings. Such negative connotations of students in alternative education miss moments of success when, despite being labeled at risk, students perform well and graduate from high school while undergoing alternative education. The narratives of at-risk students who have been academically successful are scant compared to the dominant trend in literature where these students are seen as failures as well as social and economic liabilities. The purpose of Dr. Watson's study, which was the purpose of this qualitative narrative inquiry study, was to explore the experience of two graduates who credit their alternative education as playing a role in their completion of high school in South Texas. So let's look at narrative inquiry. Connolly and Clendenin from the 1990s really kind of coined that term and developed a fairly new, relatively new, among qualitative research designs, a design that look at the perceptions and personal stories of teachers. So Connolly and Clendenin can kind of say that they coined that term, narrative inquiry, through their perceptions and personal stories of teachers. So narrative inquiry focuses on how individuals assign meaning to their experience through the stories that they tell, which is very different than phenomenology, which is looking at the lived experiences based on one particular phenomenon. Narratives are always interlinked between an individual and their social and cultural context, so narratives can't be isolated or looked at as independent of the context. Participants are offered the opportunity to share their experiences, and then in relational ways, the researcher inquires into and about these experiences. So if you want to look at what this approach truly is, it's the study of life experiences as a storied phenomenon. As I shared, in contrast to phenomenology, where the goal is to describe the essence of the experience of a phenomena, the narrative researcher really wants to discover the individual storied experience through the stories from the participants themselves. They look at the threads, the tensions, the plot lines, the coherences or silences, and then compose that narrative account of the participants' stories. Narrative researchers also inquire into the institutional, social, familial, and cultural narratives in which each participant's experiences are embedded to determine how these shape their individual experiences and their told stories. When we look at data collection for narrative inquiry, we have to look at the fact that there's the distinctive feature of narrative research, and what that distinctive feature is the story meaning is contextualized. In-depth interviews are really the main and primary data collection method, and they can do this through the life history method, which focuses on the unfolding history of one person's experiences. So life histories emphasize the importance of listening to the voices of the research participants. And your goal as that narrative researcher is to penetrate on a deep level by allowing participants to reflect on and relate their own stories and present their own viewpoints and perspectives. And when I think about narrative inquiry, I think about the importance of the researcher to be able to listen. When you are a counselor and you are in your counselor training, you are taught the importance of listening. And the same goes with the narrative inquiry researcher. You don't want to fill the silence with your own voice. You want to allow the participants to tell their stories. So very important. So now we move on to how do we analyze narrative inquiry? A narrative analysis attends to looking at the social context of story production. The story elements, they're contextualized within the actual stories being explored, and they're retold. The chronology is very central in narrative inquiry, as it allows participants to recall specific places, changes, situations within their life histories. And just as when you read a fiction book, normally will start at the beginning, have a middle, and an end. And that's one way and one reason that the narrative approach must rely on chronology, is so things line up and things make sense. There's another term called restorying, which is the process of gathering stories, analyzing themes for key elements like the time, the place, the plot, the environment, and then rewriting those stories to place them within a chronological sequence. So if you have, say, 5 participants in a narrative inquiry, you could restory to put their stories in chronological order. And this is methods of data analysis for narrative inquiry. Now, how do we present the findings? The way that we present the findings is taking a literary orientation or a chronological approach, the way the story changes over time. You want to actively engage the participant in collaboration throughout the presentation of the findings, so the findings are presented accurately and chronologically. Researchers present participants' stories while at the same time remaining reflective about their own personal and political backgrounds and agendas, because you really want to share those narratives from the participants. And this reflexivity shapes how researchers restory the participants' account. So with that, if we look at some examples of narrative inquiry, next slide, please. You have the one that I read the small piece from, and that's Dr. Michael Watson from Texas A&M University. We have Patricia Randall Long from the University of Tennessee, Teresa Nugent from Western Michigan University, and Sarah Lynn Crump from the University of Missouri, Kansas. So these were examples that I shared with you of narrative inquiry, as well as examples of ethnography. One thing I do want to share is a term that we talked about last week in phenomenology, and that was bracketing, or the bracketing interview. We can also use that bracketing interview when we are in narrative inquiry and we are looking and reflecting about our own personal and political backgrounds and agendas to become very transparent. Normally, your chair or your SME or both will conduct that bracketing interview with you to find out your background, your beliefs, your agendas, your perceptions, your experiences with the topic of your research, to be so transparent, because we don't have reliability and validity necessarily with qualitative research. We have trustworthiness. This bracketing interview is another option to be able to get to that transparency. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boberg. I just want to stay for a moment on this topic of bracketing interview. I just want to explain to everybody that bracketing is typically a phenomenological concept, but Dr. Boberg has done research and has actually engaged in bracketing interviews herself with her own dissertation and then beyond that. And so if anybody is interested in this concept, because it's really key to phenomenology, but also applies to many other types and designs of qualitative research as well, we're happy to talk about this further. And Dr. Boberg especially is pretty much an expert on this, more than I am, because she's experienced this herself. Remember, reflexivity and transparency is critical in qualitative research, and the bracketing interview is a really important practice so that you set yourself up as a trustworthy researcher. So again, any conversation around bracketing interviews will be greatly welcomed.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg.
Of course, and thank you for your great overview of ethnography and narrative inquiry, I'm going to move now to grounded theory. And what I'm going to do is similar to what Dr. Boberg did at the introduction of each of her research designs that she presented. I'm going to present a short excerpt from a grounded theory dissertation entitled A Grounded Theory Approach to Faculty Perspectives and Patterns of Online Social Presence. And this particular study was conducted by Rebecca Cox Davenport at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I'm going to read from her dissertation so that you understand a little bit more about her study, why grounded theory was the chosen research design, and what was the outcome of her study. The purpose of this research study was to generate a grounded theory regarding the patterns and perceptions of nursing faculty in the formation of social processes in an online course. Employing a grounded theory approach, this researcher built upon the theoretical concepts of the community of inquiry model, which was developed by Garrison, Anderson, and Archer in 2000. The community of inquiry model illustrates the inner workings of the online educational experience. The model itself consists of three main components: social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. These three elements of presence overlap to demonstrate how each factor influences the others in terms of engaging in online learning. This particular study sought to better understand the overlap of social presence and teaching presence that the model distinguished as climate factors. To explore the underpinnings of the climate factors themselves, this researcher interviewed online master's level nurse educators, observed their online courses, and examined their course syllabi for creation of social presence. From the data of this study emerged a substantive theory. Humanizing was found to be the climate factor central to establishing social presence. The findings of the study illustrated that humanizing the course climate leads each member of the community to see the other members as real people, thus enabling the establishment of online social presence in an online course within a virtual environment. With the establishment of humanizing as the core climate factor, theoretical concepts emerged from this grounded theory study that describe the patterns and perceptions of faculty initiating and maintaining online social presence. These theoretical concepts developed in the study included A, faculty patterns, and B, faculty perceptions. Faculty patterns included cyber role modeling, maintenance, and awareness. Faculty perception included meaningful socialization, facilitating connections, and student control. Overall, the faculty described a combination of patterns and perceptions which are called lifelines. And these lifelines are what led this particular researcher, Rebecca Cox Davenport, to develop her own theory called the lifeline theory that was grounded in the data of this particular study. Let's look at grounded theory, starting with an overview of the major concepts. And as you will see, this is a sharp break from many of the other research designs. It's very, very specific in its approach and in its makeup, as you will see. Glaser and Strauss first wrote the discovery of grounded theory in 1967. And in their book, which was considered a groundbreaking text in the field of qualitative research, they proposed an alternative to classical hypothetico-deductive research, which was the way research had been conducted up until that point. And they proposed that the purpose of grounded theory is to inductively generate a theory that is grounded in and which emerges from the data of that particular study. The goal is to move beyond description, with data analysis beginning right at the very, very beginning of the study, unlike other research designs. The data analysis starts at the moment of initial contact with the event or the experience being studied and continues throughout the development of a grounded theory. That is, the theory that's grounded in the data of the study. The researcher generates or discovers a theory of a process, an action, or an interaction grounded in the experiences of the research participants themselves. Now remember, the research participants would all have experienced the same process, action, or interaction. And the development of the theory explains that process, action, or interaction and might provide a framework for future research as well. So as you can see, before I move to the next slide, which is the data collection methods, I want everybody to really understand that the purpose of grounded theory is to develop a new theory. If a new theory is not developed, then the grounded theory study has in effect not taken place. So let's look for a moment now at the methods of data collection that characterize this very highly specialized research design. Grounded theory methods consist of systematic yet flexible guidelines for collecting and analyzing qualitative data to construct a theory from the data themselves. Open-ended interviews and observations are used to collect data. And as I've mentioned previously on the previous slide, data collection and data analysis are not separate processes. These are concurrent and continual activities that continue throughout the duration of study, starting from the very, very, very beginnings. As I said previously, data analysis is not a process that occurs down the line. Data analysis occurs from the very initial point of contact, because remember, the goal is to develop a theory. And so analysis of the data starts right from the very, very beginning and continues alongside data collection. So data collection and data analysis are in essence intertwined, interconnected processes throughout. Let's look a little bit more specifically at the methods of data analysis. So grounded theory was the first qualitative research design to adopt a systematic approach for codifying and categorizing data. And this approach is based on a concept called theoretical sampling of different groups. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Chalmers, who's one of the key writers of grounded theory today. And she writes, "You conduct theoretical sampling by sampling to develop properties of your categories until no new properties emerge. Thus, you saturate your categories with data and subsequently sort and/or diagram them to integrate your emerging theory." Now, if we think about this for a moment, it's highly specialized. And this is why grounded theory is cautioned in many institutions as a research design for dissertation research, A, because it is so highly specialized, and B, because the timing to develop a theory can take a long time, extending into years. And very often dissertation research is not set up to be that prolonged. So I'm just mentioning that now, and we're going to be coming back to that in a little while. There's a little bit more to say about analysis as well, because it's such a central concept in grounded theory. A primary characteristic of this design is what is called the constant comparative method of data analysis, and that is the ongoing comparison of data with emerging categories. So the researcher, as I said previously, is beginning to conduct analysis right from the very, very beginning of the study, collecting data, analyzing data, and doing this in an ongoing fashion in order to compare the data with the categories that are emerging from the data. Researchers construct meaning from research findings through 3 phases of coding. And again, this is much more highly specialized than the coding that would occur in some of the other research designs, because this includes 3 phases: open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. And again, if these 3 phases are not conducted rigorously, the trustworthiness and the credibility and the rigor of a qualitative grounded theory design of the particular study would be called into question. And so again, the highly specialized nature of this cannot be underestimated. Firstly, substantive codes are developed during the first phase, which is called open coding. Next comes axial coding, which brings the data back together again into a coherent whole after the researcher has fractured the data or broken it apart through line-by-line coding in the axial coding phase. And then finally, the third phase is called theoretical coding, where the codes are described in terms of possible relationships between selective codes, thereby helping to form theoretical models, which in essence is the theory itself. Let's move to the ways in which a grounded theory study is actually presented. The theory itself emerges mostly by way of memos in which the researcher records ideas about the evolving theory throughout the analytic process. Ongoing creation of memos promotes deeper learning and reflection as the theory is developed by the researcher. The result of the process of data collection and data analysis, which, as I said, is intertwined and cannot be separated out from each other, is the development of a substantial level theory that is written and presented by the researcher. As I pointed out in the study, the grounded theory approach to faculty perspective and patterns in online social presence of Rebecca Cox Davenport, you can see that she developed a brand new theory called the lifeline theory. And that is the goal of grounded theory, to develop a brand new substantial level theory that has not been written before or never been presented before, because it actually grows or develops or emerges out of the data of a particular study. And remember, every single study is different. So new theory develops out of a unique study. The theory can also be tested to determine whether it can apply to other samples or populations. And the study could also end at this point, with the generation of the theory, the development of the theory, being the end goal and the final presentation of the research. So there are two options. The theory can be tested to determine if it can apply to other situations, and we know that this is called transferability in qualitative research, or the study can end with the theory. And that is a perfectly acceptable way of conducting and finalizing a grounded theory study, and a respectable way to conduct the study, because the theory that is developed is something brand new and is of value to the research community in and of itself. Over here, we have collected a number of what Dr. Boberg and I feel are excellent, rigorous, grounded theory studies. William Feeler from the University of Nebraska, Kristen Nelson from UMass, Rebecca Cox Davenport, University of Nevada, which is the one I read from to you, and Takara Stark from the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, and David Hyland from Chapman University. And as Dr. Boberg pointed out, when she presented the research examples for ethnography and narrative inquiry, when you do come to look at these studies, focus in on the study's problem, purpose, and research questions, and then try and figure out how grounded theory was chosen to address the particular problem and purpose of the study. This will give you a really good idea of how a grounded theory study can and should be set up based on a particular problem, purpose, and research questions. So that, in a nutshell, explained grounded theory, which is really, as I say, highly specialized and is a great design and will also require a great amount of skill. So having discussed today's three research designs, being ethnography, narrative inquiry, and grounded theory, I want to move forward for a few moments before we open this up to questions, just to a few aspects to point out. Firstly, that this webinar is based largely on information from my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, A Roadmap from Beginning to End, which is currently in its 5th edition. And out of this book, we developed the material for the webinar, and we also have drawn upon seminal authors and other authors to illustrate points that we present in the webinar. And these are presented in the references a little further on. I just also want to draw your attention to a tool that I developed, which is presented in this book as figure 6.3, which is called Mapping Your Research Design. And this is a useful tool to help you map out your study in terms of the problem, purpose, and research questions, and then try and figure out what might be the most appropriate research design to select. Because remember, as I emphasize throughout, and as Dr. Boberg and I continually emphasize, all the elements, being the problem, purpose, and research questions, must align with your chosen research design. That is an essential, non-negotiable point in qualitative research. So right now, with all the information that we've been presenting to you today and last week, because I know a lot of people on this call were also on the call last week, there are many questions that you should be asking yourself. And we're going to just go over some of these before we move into the actual question and answer section for this presentation. Which design does my research problem fit best with? What is the purpose of my research? What research questions am I wanting to answer? Am I able to clearly show alignment among my study's problem, purpose, and research questions with the chosen research design? And finally, is the chosen design a suitable match with my research skills and experience as a student researcher? And this is something that is really important to consider as you move forward in choosing a research design. Alignment and methodological congruence are essential. And as I mentioned previously, and I'm not going to go through all the points on this because I want to try and get to the question and answers as quickly as possible so that we have time for that. But alignment and methodological congruence are essential considerations in choosing your design. Another point we want to make very clear is that specificity is essential. And researchers are really cautioned against adopting what is sometimes referred to as a generic approach, as outlined by Cayley in 2014 in their article called Generic Qualitative Approaches, Pitfalls and Benefits of Methodological Mixology. Generic approaches can sometimes be referred to in the literature as descriptive, general, basic, traditional, interpretive, developmental, and pragmatic. And in contrast to the major qualitative research designs, a generic approach is not an established design in and of itself because it borrows methods from other qualitative designs. And in the article that I just cited, the authors call it methodological mixology. Most qualitative studies will naturally fall into one of the 5 established research designs. And although some arguments can be made to defend the flexible nature of a generic approach is strongly criticized for its limited supporting literature and the resulting lack of a strong foundation, the absence of definition, and the lack of a clear methodology. And all of this constitutes a significant lack of rigor in qualitative research. So we do urge you to try and choose one of the major 5 research designs as opposed to going with a generic approach, which is not a design in and of itself in the literature. So what we're going to do now is open up in the final 10 minutes for questions and discussion. And what we don't get to in today's presentation, we will continue the discussion in the Commons as we did with part 1 of this webinar series. So Emily, could you please let us know what some of the questions are, and Dr. Boberg and I will gladly respond.
Great, thank you so much. And then folks, for all of our participants, if you do have further questions, I was able to pull everything that did come in the chat so far. So just let me know if anything else pops up. First question. Let me scroll up here. Do researchers have to be on location amongst participants in order to use ethnography?
My experience has been, and I was very lucky to have as my dissertation chair from Northern Arizona University, an educational anthropologist who does a lot of ethnographic research. And her answer to that would be, yes, you almost need to embed yourself within the group, the culture that you are studying. All of the books that I have read on ethnographic research, everyone has embedded themselves into that particular group, organization, culture as a participant observer, so they can really get to the nature of the interactions, the behaviors, and what they're looking for to answer in their study.
Thank you, Dr. Boberg.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. What would you say would be the main difference between ethnography and phenomenology?
So from ethnography and phenomenology?
Yeah, that was the question. Yeah, that was the question. What would you say would be one of the main differences between ethnography and phenomenology?
Well, phenomenology, you're looking, the individuals are looking at the researchers looking at a particular lived experience of an individual. And I don't know if this individual was on last week, but I gave the example of somebody who wanted to study the experiences of those who were in the footprint of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, and interview those people, you know, that watched the planes go into the Twin Towers. That would be a phenomenology because you're looking at a lived experience, whereas in ethnography, you are really embedding yourself in the culture to look at how the people interact, what their beliefs are, what their traditions are, their folkways and mores, how they live their lives, what's important to them, what's not. So a phenomenology is really looking at one particular aspect of a lived experience that people share, whereas the ethnography is looking at the culture of a whole group of individuals and really how they live their lives over a period of time.
Right. And I just want to add to that. That's a great explanation, Dr. Boberg. And I just want to add to that, that phenomenology is about the essence of experience, that everybody is experiencing of the same phenomenon. Whereas if you think of ethnography, just think of anthropology. And anthropology is the study of a culture-bearing group. As Dr. Boberg said, the folkways and mores and cultural patterns that are embedded into that cultural group. And the researcher, the ethnographer, as in an anthropologist, is really embedding themselves within that culture over a prolonged period of time to understand those folkways, mores, and cultural artifacts.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I am going to ask just one more piece on the ethnography for right now, and then I have a question about self-narrative. But it seems, though, given the time restraints of dissertation process, in your opinion, is ethnography less likely used because of the time commitment involved in gathering that type of research? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say most likely yes, if there are time constraints for the individual completing their dissertation research. Because if they really want to embed themselves in that organization, that group, or whatever, that's going to take a bit of time. So unless you are planning on having, taking a year or 2 years to get your dissertation completed, as far as the data collection piece, I would say it would be difficult unless you were in that anthropological position to do that.
And I do appreciate you sharing your thought on that. Dr. Bloomberg, anything you want to add?
No, I think Dr. Boberg has explained it, that a lot of these designs that we discussed here today, and even last week, the phenomenology, are highly specialized. And that is why understanding research designs is so critical, because one needs to be aware of the time constraints, the requirements, the characteristics that make up a design, so that you don't water down a design or use a design that is not aligned to your problem and purpose. So there are a lot of considerations including the time constraints and the skill of the researcher in choosing an appropriate design.
Thank you, Dr. Wilberg. And then forgive me, I do have this comment up in the chat somewhere, but the question is as such. And so let me know if I do need to have the person expand on it. Can the focus be on a self-narrative in the research design process?
Yes, there is such a thing as a self-narrative, but again, it's a very highly specialized design, because the researcher, is the focus of the research. And as with an autoethnography, this is a highly specialized design that will require quite a bit of skill. So if this is something somebody is intending to do, there's a lot of literature out there on this very highly specialized design, and would be absolutely advisable to be very clear on what is required because of the skill involved.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our next question. Would the bracketing interview occur before or after the dissertation topic approval?
Well, normally, I will give you the example that happened with me. Once my committee was chosen and my topic was identified and just my topic was approved, before anything else was done, my dissertation chair and my it was a co-chair in charge of the research portion of my dissertation. Each of them did individual bracketing interviews with me really prior to me even completing the first chapter of my dissertation. So my perceptions, my experiences, my background, my assumptions were all out there and transparent at the beginning of my dissertation. So there was no questions. People knew the experience I had on the topic. They knew what perspective I was coming from. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Boberg. I'm going to move on. I know we only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one last question. There was a few questions we didn't get to, but I will provide that to our faculty presenting this evening, just so we can have follow-up conversations in the comments about it. But can a case study dissertation be done in the time frame allowed at the university? Can it be done, I guess is the question.
I'll take that. Yes, absolutely. Most of our dissertations are actually case study dissertations, because case study is the most widely used design and also the most widely applicable design. So case study is very well suited to dissertation research because it's a bounded system. It's a system of boundaries that are bounding your case. So it's much more controlled, it's much more specific, it requires much less skill than some of these other highly skilled and highly specialized designs. And it's a highly respected design in its own right. I just want to make sure also that people understand there is such a thing as a descriptive case study, and that is perfectly acceptable as a research design. When I referred earlier to descriptive as part of generic, that's in terms of generic approach, but a descriptive case study is an established research design.
Linda, I'll jump in. Don't forget, exploratory case studies are also very appropriate.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, wonderful.
Yep. So case study is very versatile. As you can see, you can have a descriptive case study, an exploratory case study, and case study really does fit with a lot of the research problems that are used in a dissertation, so that it is contained and manageable. And I highly recommend people to read up on case study to see if it could fit with the problem and purpose and research questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg, Dr. Boberg. Any closing thoughts before I wrap up for the evening?
Not from me, just to say thank you so much to you, Emily, and to the Graduate Study Support Center for having us, for facilitating the discussion. As always, your support and assistance is greatly appreciated. And I'll just give Dr. Boberg a final word as well.
Well, and I thank you too, Emily, for setting this up. This has been wonderful. And I want to thank everybody that attended for taking the time out and the interest to learn about the Big 5 qualitative research designs.
Absolutely. And thank you so much to all of our attendees that have come to during our two-part session here. We're always looking for your feedback as students walking the walk. So if there's something you'd like to see more of in the future, please don't hesitate to follow up on our survey at the close of this Zoom. And until the next time, I hope everybody has a great rest of your evening. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.